As they drove away from the mansion, the light of dawn seemed to cleanse the horror of the night from their minds. Yet, despite the apparent victory, a palpable tension clung to each of them, a silent acknowledgement that some terrors, once awakened, and never fully banished. The road unfurled before them, leading back to the familiarity of their town, away from the haunted confines of Oakwood Hollow. Sarah, still weak but recovering, rested her head against the window, watching the scenery blur by. The others exchanged quiet glances, each lost in their own thoughts, the events of the night replaying like a macabre film in their minds. "We should have left it alone." Emma finally broke the silence, her voice a mix of regret and relief. "We went looking for ghosts, and we found them. Or maybe they found us." James nodded, his hands tight on the wheel. "But we faced it together, and we won," he said, trying to inject some optimism into the weary group. "Whatever that thing was, we sent it back to wherever it came from." "But at what cost?" Derek murmured, staring back at the receding silhouette of the mansion. "These kinds of places, they change you." The car fell silent again, each pondering Derek's words. The early morning light did little to dispel the shadows that seemed to linger around them, shadows that were perhaps more internal than external now. As they neared the town, Emily, who had been quiet for most of the ride, suddenly spoke up. "There's something we're forgetting," she said, her brow furrowed in concentration. "The diary." Mrs. Harrow's diary mentioned a guardian. What if it wasn't the house or the entity we dealt with last night? What if there's something else? Sarah completed Emily's thought, her voice weak but filled with a dawning horror. James pulled the car over, the realization setting in. They looked at each other, the same fear reflected in their eyes. "We need to go back," he said, the decision heavy in his heart. Turning the car around, they headed back to the mansion as the sun rose higher, casting long, dark shadows across the road. The feeling of dread grew with each mile, a stark contrast to the beauty of the dawn. Arriving at the mansion once more, they approached with a newfound caution, and not just with their previous tools, but with a deeper understanding of what they were facing. They entered the quiet, ominous mansion, the morning light streaming through broken windows, casting eerie patterns on the dust-covered floor. In the basement, where they had faced the entity, they found the remnants of their earlier confrontation. The burnt-out candles, the washed-away pentagram, and amidst it all, the diary that Emily had mentioned. Opening it to the last entry they hadn't read the night before, James read aloud, "Beware the guardian of the threshold, keeper of the balance, bound to the land and the Harrow blood." It wasn't just the entity. This guardian might still be here, bound to protect this place, Emily said, a chill running down her spine. They spread out, searching for any sign of this guardian, any clue that could lead them to understand and perhaps appease it. It was MIA who found the hidden room behind a false wall in the library. Inside, an altar, and on it, an old, dust-covered tome that seemed to pulse with a quiet power. "This must be it," Derek said, his voice echoing slightly in the small room. "This could be the key to finally freeing this place." Gathering around the tome, they began to read the incantations written in a language that seemed ancient and forgotten. As they spoke the words together, the air in the room grew thick, and the sense of an unseen presence became almost palpable. The ground trembled slightly, a soft but distinct vibration that grew in intensity as they continued the chant. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stilled. A peace descended upon the room, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the mansion lifted, replaced by a serene calm. They left the room, feeling the change not just in the atmosphere but within themselves. The shadows that had seemed so menacing now appeared just ordinary, dispelled by the light of day. As they walked out of the mansion, the air felt cleaner, lighter. Their house, once a symbol of dread, now stood silent and benign under the morning sun. Driving away from Oakwood Hollow for the last time, they knew they had left behind more than just a haunted mansion. They had faced their fears, uncovered truths meant to stay hidden, and had come out changed. The road ahead was clear, the sky bright, and as they looked back one final time, the mansion no longer loomed ominously. Instead, it seemed to fade into the landscape, just another part of as they drove away from the mansion, the light of dawn seemed to cleanse the horror of the night from their minds. Yet, despite the apparent victory, a palpable tension clung to each of them, a silent acknowledgement that some terrors, once awakened, and never fully banished. The road unfurled before them, leading back to the familiarity of their town, away from the haunted confines of Oakwood Hollow. Sarah, still weak but recovering, rested her head against the window, watching the scenery blur by. The others exchanged quiet glances, each lost in their own thoughts, the events of the night replaying like a macabre film in their minds. "We should have left it alone," Mia finally broke the silence, her voice a mix of regret and relief. "We went looking for ghosts, and we found them. Or maybe they found us." James nodded, his hands tight on the wheel. "But we faced it together, and we won," he said, trying to inject some optimism into the weary group. "Whatever that thing was, we sent it back to wherever it came from." "But at what cost?" Derek murmured, staring back at the receding silhouette of the mansion. "These kinds of places, they change you." The car fell silent again, each pondering Derek's words. The early morning light did little to dispel the shadows that seemed to linger around them, shadows that were perhaps more internal than external now. As they neared the town, Emily, who had been quiet for most of the ride, suddenly spoke up. "There's something we're forgetting," she said, her brow furrowed in concentration. "The diary." Mrs. Harrow's diary mentioned a guardian. What if it wasn't the house or the entity we dealt with last night? What if there's something else? Sarah completed Emily's thought, her voice weak but filled with a dawning horror. James pulled the car over, the realization setting in. They looked at each other, the same fear reflected in their eyes. "We need to go back," he said, the decision heavy in his heart. Turning the car around, they headed back to the mansion as the sun rose higher, casting long, dark shadows across the road. The feeling of dread grew with each mile, a stark contrast to the beauty of the dawn. Arriving at the mansion once more, they approached with a newfound caution, and not just with their previous tools but with a deeper understanding of what they were facing. They entered the quiet, ominous mansion, the morning light streaming through broken windows, casting eerie patterns on the dust-covered floor. In the basement, where they had faced the entity, they found the remnants of their earlier confrontation. The burnt-out candles, the washed-away pentagram, and amidst it all, the diary that Emily had mentioned. Opening it to the last entry they hadn't read the night before, James read aloud, "Beware the guardian of the threshold, keeper of the balance, bound to the land and the Harrow blood." It wasn't just the entity. This guardian might still be here, bound to protect this place, Emily said, a chill running down her spine. They spread out, searching for any sign of this guardian, any clue that could lead them to understand and perhaps appease it. It was Mia who found the hidden room behind a false wall in the library. Inside, an altar, and on it, an old, dust-covered tone that seemed to pulse with a quiet power. "This must be it," Derek said, his voice echoing slightly in the small room. "This could be the key to finally freeing this place." Gathering around the tome, they began to read the incantations written in a language that seemed ancient and forgotten. As they spoke the words together, the air in the room grew thick, and the sense of an unseen presence became almost palpable. The ground trembled slightly, a soft but distinct vibration that grew in intensity as they continued the chant. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stilled. A peace descended upon the room, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the mansion lifted, replaced by a serene calm. They left the room, feeling the change not just in the atmosphere but within themselves. The shadows that had seemed so menacing now appeared just ordinary, dispelled by the light of day. As they walked out of the mansion, the air felt cleaner, lighter. Their house, once a symbol of dread, now stood silent and benign under the morning sun. Driving away from Oakwood Hollow for the last time, they knew they had left behind more than just a haunted mansion. They had faced their fears, uncovered truths meant to stay hidden, and had come out changed. The road ahead was clear, the sky bright, and as they looked back one final time, the mansion no longer loomed ominously. Instead, it seemed to fade into the landscape, just another part of the forgotten tapestry of a once turbulent history. As the distance between them and the mansion grew, so did a creeping suspicion that the peace they felt was merely the eye of the storm, a brief respite before the true tempest. The further they drove, the more the landscape seemed to subtly warp. Trees leaned towards their passing car with unnatural angles, and shadows stretched across the road, as if trying to pull them back. Emily broke the silence first. "Something's not right," she murmured, staring intently at the passing woods. "It's like the world is bending around us." Her words were a cold echo of their deepest fears. The sense of normalcy they had briefly enjoyed was evaporating, replaced by a familiar dread that crawled up their spines. James, his hands tightening on the steering wheel, nodded in agreement. "We thought we ended it, but maybe we just stirred something deeper, something older," he said, his voice strained as he navigated the increasingly twisting road. The car's headlights flickered momentarily, casting them into darkness before flaring back to life. In those brief seconds of darkness, Mia swore she saw figures flitting between the trees, their movements too swift and erratic to be human. "We need to go back," Derek suddenly declared, his voice filled with a new urgency. "We haven't finished this. Whatever we did back there, it was just the beginning." "But we can't just turn around," Sarah argued, her voice weak but insistent. "We need a plan, more knowledge. We're not prepared for what's waiting for us." The conversation was cut short by a sudden, sharp sound, a tire bursting. James fought for control as the car swerved violently, finally coming to a stop at the side of the road. They climbed out, their hearts pounding, only to find that the tire hadn't just burst, it had been shredded, as if by claws. As they gathered around the ruined tire, the forest around them seemed to close in, the shadows deepening and the air growing chill. The sense of being watched was palpable, and every small sound seemed amplified, a branch snapping, leaves rustling. "We're not alone," Emily said, her eyes scanning the tree line. "Something followed us, or maybe it led us here." The group hurriedly replaced the tire, their movements frantic and uncoordinated in their rush. As they worked, the sensation of encroaching darkness grew stronger, the daylight dimming unnaturally fast. Once back on the road, the atmosphere inside the car was tense, each noise from the surrounding forest magnifying their anxiety. The road seemed unfamiliar now, longer and more winding than before, as if reshaping itself with every mile they covered. As darkness fell, an impenetrable fog descended upon them, the headlights struggling to pierce the gloom. The road became barely visible, and James slowed to a crawl, his eyes straining to see through the mist. "That's not natural fog," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "Look at it, it's moving against the wind." They all watched in silent horror as the fog swirled and coalesced into forms that were almost human, faces pressing against the windows, their features twisted in torment. Sarah screamed, pointing to a figure that had appeared directly in front of the car. James slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a stop inches from what looked like a child standing in the middle of the road. But as they looked closer, they realized it was no child, it was a twisted, shadowy mimicry of one, its eyes hollow pools of despair. The figures in the fog began to converge on the car, their hands leaving smears on the windows as they pressed closer. The air inside the car grew cold, their breaths visible as they exchanged looks of sheer terror. "We can't stay here," Derek said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "We have to drive through them." With no other options, James hit the gas, the car lurching forward. The figures in the fog seemed to dissolve as the car passed through them, but the feeling of cold malice lingered, clinging to their skin like a shroud. They drove in silence, each mile taking them deeper into a night that no longer felt like it belonged to the world they knew. The road ahead was shrouded in darkness and mist, the way forward uncertain. As the hours stretched on, the tension in the car became almost unbearable. Each turn in the road, each movement in the fog seemed charged with potential horror. The feeling of being led, of being drawn deeper into a web of darkness, was overwhelming. Finally, as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the trees, they found themselves back at the edge of Oakwood Hollow. The town seemed deserted, the houses dark and silent as they drove through. Stopping in the center of the town, they got out of the car, their bodies stiff from the tension and the long night. The silence was oppressive, each sound they made seeming unnaturally loud as it echoed through the empty streets. The air was still, heavy with the scent of something rotten, and the light mist that clung to everything gave the town an ethereal, otherworldly look. "Something's very wrong," Emily whispered, her eyes scanning the shadowed porches and curtained windows of the nearby houses. "It's like the whole town is holding its breath." They moved as a group, their steps cautious, heading towards the town hall, the central point in Oakwood Hollow. The building stood as they remembered, stately and imposing, but now it had an air of desolation, as if it had been abandoned in haste. As they approached the steps, the front doors of the town hall burst open with a crash, startling them. A figure staggered out, clutching at the air as if drowning. It was the mayor of Oakwood Hollow, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Help us," he gasped, collapsing at their feet. It came back, it never left. James and Derek rushed to help him up, his words sending a chill through them. "What came back? What are you talking about?" James demanded. "The Guardian, the curse, we thought it was over," the mayor stammered, his voice a mix of pain and fear. "But it was just the beginning. After you left, things got worse. The shadows, they didn't just haunt the mansion. They spread." Sarah knelt beside him, her medical training kicking in as she checked his vitals. "We need to get him to a hospital," she said urgently. "There's no time," the mayor whispered, grabbing her arm with surprising strength. "You must go back to the mansion. Only there can you end this forever." His words hung in the air as he slumped back, unconscious. The group exchanged worried glances. Going back to the mansion was the last thing they wanted, but the desperation in the mayor's voice was impossible to ignore. With a heavy heart, they loaded the mayor into their car and drove him to the local clinic before preparing themselves for the inevitable return to the mansion. As they gathered their supplies, flashlights, salt, holy water, and the old home they had found, they felt like soldiers going into a battle they were not sure they could win. The drive back to the mansion was tense, each mile closer adding weight to the suffocating atmosphere of dread. The sun was high in the sky now, but its light seemed dim, as if filtered through a thick veil of smoke. When they arrived, the mansion loomed before them, its windows like dark, watching eyes. The air was thick with a palpable sense of malice, and the ground itself seemed to pulse with a slow, steady beat, like the heart of some great, slumbering beast. "Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it quickly," Derek said, his voice low. "I have a feeling we're running out of time." They entered the mansion, the familiar creak of the door sending shivers down their spines. Inside, the air was cool and musty, the silence of the house oppressive. They made their way to the basement, the site of their last confrontation, each step taking them deeper into the darkness. As they descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and their breaths became visible. The basement was just as they had left it, but now the symbols on the floor were glowing faintly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "We need to find the heart of this curse," Emily said, opening the tome to a page marked with a red ribbon. "According to this, we need to perform a ritual, but it requires all of us. We all have a part to play." Gathering in a circle around the glowing symbols, they began the ritual, reciting the ancient words from the tome. As they spoke, the air around them began to vibrate, the ground beneath them trembling. The shadows seemed to swirl and coalesce, forming into a dark, towering figure in the center of the circle. "We invoke thee, guardian of the threshold," they chanted, their voices united in determination. "Release this land from your grasp." The figure in the shadows roared, a sound so loud and terrifying it shook the mansion to its foundations. The air cracked with energy, the symbols on the floor blazing with light. As the ritual reached its climax, the figure lunged at them, its form becoming more defined, a grotesque mix of human and shadow. They continued the chant, their voices louder now, pushing through their fear as the figure reached out with shadowy tendrils. Just as the tendrils were about to envelop them, the light from the symbols shot upwards, enveloping the figure in a blinding glow. The roar of the guardian was cut off abruptly as it disintegrated under the intense light, its form collapsing into nothing more than a wisp of smoke that dissipated into the air. The ground ceased its trembling, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted as if a great weight had been removed from the mansion and from their own shoulders. Breathing heavily, the group looked around in disbelief. The basement was now just a basement, devoid of the ominous energy that had pervaded it just moments before. The symbols on the floor were no longer glowing, they looked like mere chalk marks, harmless and inert. "We did it," James said, his voice filled with relief and exhaustion. "It's really over this general feeling time." Everyone let out a collective sigh, their tension melting away, replaced by a fatigue that seemed to seep into their bones now that the adrenaline had faded. They supported each other as they ascended the basement stairs, the light from the setting sun spilling into the mansion through dusty windows, casting everything in a soft, golden glow. As they stepped outside, the air felt fresher, the sky more vivid than they remembered it ever being. The mansion itself looked less imposing now, more like an ordinary, albeit old, house that had seen better days. They didn't speak much on the drive back into town, each was lost in their own thoughts, processing the events they had experienced. When they reached the town, the sense of normalcy was startling. People were walking their dogs, children were playing in the streets, and there was no sign of the darkness that had threatened to consume them all. Stopping the car in front of the local diner, they decided to grab a meal together. As they sat in the booth, a sense of camaraderie and relief washing over them, they finally allowed themselves to relax completely. "It's strange," Mia said, looking out the window. "Just this morning, we were fighting for our lives, and now, everything's back to normal as if nothing had happened." "That's how these things go," Derek replied. "One minute you're in the thick of it, the next it's just memories. But we'll carry this with us forever." They shared a meal, talking and laughing, the sound of their voices a stark contrast to the silence they had endured. It felt like a celebration, a victory feast, and for a moment, all seemed right with the world. After saying their goodbyes, they went their separate ways, promising to stay in touch, to never forget the bond that had formed between them under such extraordinary circumstances. As they departed, each felt a mix of sorrow and relief, knowing that while they had survived this ordeal, it had changed them in ways they might not fully understand yet. James was the last to leave. He drove past the mansion one more time, unable to resist the urge to look at it once more. It stood silent and unassuming under the starlit sky, no longer a place of horror, but just a building with a history that few would believe. As he drove away, a chill ran down his spine, a lingering reminder that some places hold secrets, and some secrets refuse to be kept. He glanced in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see something sinister. But there was nothing there, just the road, the night, and the life he was returning to. And yet, as he looked ahead, the road seemed darker than before, the shadows deeper. A faint whisper of wind sounded almost like laughter, drifting across the fields, a haunting reminder that while this chapter had closed, the story, perhaps, was far from over. James's grip tightened on the steering wheel as the faint whisper of laughter morphed into the rustling of leaves, a sound that was normal yet felt charged with an ominous significance. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the creeping dread that lingered like the aftertaste of a nightmare. The road stretched endlessly before him, lined by the gnarled shapes of trees that seemed to watch him pass under the cloak of night. Upon arriving home, the familiar comfort of his apartment welcomed him. The walls held warmth, the lights chased away the shadows, and for a moment, James believed he could move on, leave behind the horrors of Oakwood Hollow. Yet, as he prepared for bed, the edges of his vision seemed to flicker unnaturally, as if the darkness was toying with him, reminding him of its perpetual presence. That night, as James drifted into sleep, his dreams replayed the terror in vivid detail. He wandered through endless halls of the mansion, hearing his friends call out to him from the shadows, their voices distorted by fear. He woke frequently, each time startled by the oppressive silence of his room, a stark contrast to the cacophony of his nightmares. In the days that followed, each member of the group reported similar experiences. Text messages and late-night calls became their lifeline, each conversation a shared confession of sleepless nights and unsettling occurrences. They met often, finding solace in their shared ordeal, trying to piece together a normalcy that seemed just out of reach. Determined to seek answers, James proposed one final meeting at the mansion. They agreed, drawn by the unspoken admission that their connection to the place and its spectral inhabitants was unresolved. The drive back to Oakwood Hollow was quiet, each friend lost in their apprehension and thoughts. The mansion, as they approached, stood bathed in the light of a full moon, its facade less menacing in the luminescence but no less haunting. With a collective resolve, they entered the mansion one last time. The interior was as they left it, untouched and silent, the air stale with the passage of time. Together, they walked through the empty rooms, their flashlights casting long shadows that danced along the walls. In the basement, where they had faced their darkest fears, they formed a circle, hands joined in unyielding solidarity. Closing their eyes, they spoke a vow of closure, not just for the mansion but for themselves, releasing the hold it had on their lives. As their words echoed in the still air, a gentle breeze swept through the basement. The light from their flashlights flickered once, and then steadied. When they opened their eyes, the oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a tranquil calm that permeated the room. Feeling a weight lifted from their shoulders, they left the mansion, its presence receding into the background like a bad dream at dawn. As they walked back to their cars, the air was crisp, the stars bright above them, each twinkle a silent testament to their perseverance. They parted ways at the edge of town, the bonds formed by their shared ordeal stronger than ever. As James drove home, the road before him seemed different, not darker or foreboding, but just a road. The trees no longer whispered, and the shadows no longer lurked with intent. Arriving home, James found comfort in the mundane, his bookshelf filled with familiar stories, the kettle on the stove, the soft hum of the city outside his window. That night, he slept soundly, the first dreamless sleep since the ordeal began. In the weeks and months that followed, life resumed with a new normalcy. The events at Oakwood Hollow became a distant memory, spoken of in rare, reflective conversations. They had confronted their fears, faced the unknown, and emerged not unscathed but undeterred. And while the mansion still stood, a relic of the past and a beacon of mysteries untold, it no longer haunted their lives. They knew that some shadows lingered in the corners of the world, hidden in the thickets of forgotten places. But they also knew that light was more than a mere absence of darkness, it was a promise of dawn, relentless and ever-renewing. And so, they moved forward, each step away from the shadows a step deeper into their own light.